Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the first episode of Whole Podcast. Today's topic is going to be about fear in games and movies and how they can use music, camera, lighting, and how fear actually works. Now, when you think of like a horror movie, you think of something that's scary, right? Something that makes you feel nervous, but really, it's just a normal movie, but the lighting, maybe the camera is set up differently. Because all horror movies, they use the same similar premise. They always have it dark. It seems pretty simple, right? Like darkness. But the darkness plays to their advantage because one, it hides like errors in their filming, which makes it a lot better for them too. And two, it means that they can boost up the brightness to a normal level. And it's startling because you're used to being in the dark this whole time. And then it just suddenly leaps up into brightness. I think that how fear works, like I'm not a professional on this. This is all just me thinking. I think that the fear factor kind of thing is how humanoid it can look without looking. How far from a human can it look while still looking humanoid? Like, there's a reason that all the aliens in movies still look like somewhat like people. Like, there's not just like a magic blob that has an eye somewhere, like an alien or predator. There's always some sort of humanoid figure because it has to be something that you can relate to. If it's not something then you can relate to the characters, you don't feel like you're in there and it's not as scary, basically. You have to feel like you're in there with the characters, which is really how they do it. They have to do it with the camera angle, which is why you'll see so many films that are called shaky camera, which two reasons. One, it's cheaper to film. You don't have to have a gimbal. Two, it makes it feel like you're running with the characters. So instead of just filming a character that's like running away from this other monster, let's say, you can have basically two people running and you feel like you're in the body of the camera. Normally, they use some sort of strings aspect, and it's not like a harmonious chord, it's a dissonant chord, which music has a very uniqueness to it that you can really make music to whatever you want. But they always use a dissonant chord, because a dissonant chord, it could be a tritone, it could be a diminished seventh or whatever. But it's because it makes you feel unhappy. It feels unharmonious. You could play a simple C chord on a piano, and it'll just feel like a normal piano. You could play the same thing. Minor key feels a little bit more sad. But make it diminished, it feels more like frightening and unpleasant. I'm not going to get a whole bunch into music theory, because that could be a different lesson. Next, let's move on to the use of lighting. In horror movies, there's never a brightly lit room. All the lights never work. They're always flickering in and out between barely being able to see anything and complete darkness. That gives them time to be able to actually move, let's say, the monster into a spot that they couldn't have gotten into before. Like, it'll pop up in front of the camera. And you won't expect it seeing because you won't expect it coming because it'll just pop out of nowhere. It'll just be behind for 1 second. The lights are flashing and then it'll just pop up right in front of the camera or right next to the character. And you never see it coming. But how do they do this? Like, how do you make sure the audience doesn't see it coming? It's both complex and easy at the same time. Because you have to think, what is the audience going to see? Because what they see is what the camera sees. So if you make sure the camera doesn't see it, then the audience won't see it. So you can just record different bits and bobs, different shots, then slice them all together. Most people won't notice. I'm weird like this. When I'm watching a movie or show, I don't see a movie or show. I see a bunch of different like how they create stuff. Which I guess why I don't really like horror movies, because I just feel like, well, this is all just made in a green screen room, and there's just some guy wearing a motion tracking bodysuit. Sounds pretty boring like that, but I'm weird like this. So, fear in games is a lot different than fear in movies, because in movies, you actually have to work with actors and actresses and actually move them where you want it to be. In games, you basically have free range. You can do whatever you want. Really, like, unless it's literally impossible to code, you can do whatever you want. It's your game. So, with games, you have a lot more free range, which is why some games have a better plot than movies. Some of them fail miserably. But see, you can go onto Steam and look at psychological horror games, and there will be, I think there's 13,000 psychological horror games, which is like, it's crazy, because that's more than actual horror games itself. It's because the difference between psychological horror games and horror games is, does it make you feel like it's going to happen to you later? Because if it doesn't, then that's just a horror game. Like, for instance, maybe Resident Evil would just be a horror game, because it's not really psychological. But then, like, something like Doki Doki Literature Club, this is just like just the only things I could really think of off the top of my head. That kind of makes you more think. Like, oh, what would happen if this happened in real life? Even though that's kind of a far-fetched example, because it goes into code and stuff. But what would happen if this were to happen to me, kind of thing. That's where psychological games have the edge on other games, because it can tug on your emotions of yourself. And really, it just has to be any emotion, and they can play off the emotion very well, which is why some games can make you cry, even though it's just literally just a video game. But you feel connected to the characters because of the time you spent with them, talking to them, like interacting with them, basically. So normally what they'll do is, if they want like a massive turn in the road, it's pretty easy to do. You can just have it be, let's say, I'll do Modern Warfare 2, for example, because this is a good example, or COD 4. This is one of my favorite games, and because what they do is they make you connected to one of the characters, like super connected. You feel like he's going to be a main part of it, and you're expecting it to be kind of like an action movie, like where Mission Impossible, you go in, everything seems impossible at first, but then they always get out somehow. That doesn't happen. This is kind of more realistic, somewhat as realistic as it can get, really, but is dialogue, so you feel connected to the character. And then at the end, there's a turn, basically, a betrayal, where the people that you trust the most turn on each other, really, or one of them turns on us, and you don't ever see it coming, really. And how that works in other games is, let's say I'm creating a game, okay? Something simple. And let's say the premise is you're a soldier who has like 2 friends or something. Let's just say like you're a normal person, basically, in the army. And then you just have these 2 friends. And then you're just talking to them, serving with them, basically. And you're going through all these missions with them. But then at the end, like, let's say they were never actually your friends and they were working against you somehow. That would be a massive turning point, because you thought that they were your friends. You have to have like complete opposites of what you would be expecting normally. If it's an action movie, make it sad. If it's a horror, maybe make it happy, or just make it even more horrible. That's what most people do. They try to make it as horrible as possible, which works and doesn't work. Because at some point, it just gets to the point where, like, okay, yeah, I get it, this is scary. Okay, moving on. You can have the most terrifying game or movie in the world, but no plot, and people would hate it. You have to have some sort of connection to the characters. If there's no connection, there's no sense of like being afraid for them. Because you don't really care if they die. Like in a movie, if there, let's say there's a really annoying character that you really don't like, if they get like killed by the chainsaw slash or whatever, you won't care. You'd be like, ha, look at that loser. But if it's the main character who has been like maybe slightly introverted, pretty uncomfortable, but like maybe is really good in a stressful situation, if they die, you'll feel much more connected to them because they're relatable to you, or at least how people think that they are. It's about how, it's not how people are, it's how people think they are. Like, most people aren't perfect people. I know, crazy. But people kind of think that they're better than what they are. Some people think they're worse than what they are, which is how depression happens. But some people think they're better than what they are, which most people do, just even slightly. You can kind of, like, that's how personality quizzes work. Like, they're pretty vague, but they're still specific enough to people think that they actually apply to them. And it's pretty smart, actually, because they choose different desirable traits that most people would want, but some people might not want. Like, maybe the result will say, you're introverted but have a kind heart. Well, that describes like 70% of America right now. Well, maybe it'll say, you're a strong leader who cares about others. Well, everyone wants to be a strong leader who cares about others. That's pretty general. Maybe it's like, you're stubborn, but you normally get your way. Then that's also most people. Normally people are kind of stubborn to stuff that they like. That's also kind of how horoscopes work. It kind of uses like general stuff, and then people mold themselves into it. Personally, I don't care about all of that, so this might be completely off, and I might have some people yelling at me. But really, you mold yourself to the standards that you've put yourself in. You could completely mix up all the signs and just add the lists together. And this is an actual study. People picked the ones that they thought applied the best. And I think 75% of people didn't pick their own horoscope that they were. So there's nothing to do with you actually being that person. It's because you put yourself slightly higher than what you are and what you strive to be, which is good, but it's also, you don't want to aim too high, because that's how narcissism happens. You don't want to be a narcissist. That's bad. Now, in games, it's easier than in movies, because normally it's first person or third person. You have a character that you're in. And that's more interesting because you're in a character. You're actually one of the characters. Something can happen to you. In movies, it's sometimes. It's rare when you see an actual movie that's filmed in first person and the camera is a person, but they do exist. Normally they're lower budget films, but they'll normally have better plots, so they still do well. Games are different though, because you're in the character, so you can kind of make it happen to you. But they want you to feel like you're relatable to the character, because otherwise it just feels like you're just in someone else's body. So they kind of leave it blank, but strong enough where you can still feel an emotional connection to your character. Like, let's say you're a normal person. Actually, no. Some games do emotional connections better than others, which is why the campaigns get rated better. But maybe it's an action game and the connection isn't as important, then they won't focus on the connection, they'll focus more on the gameplay. But maybe it's a psychological game. Like, I have this one open before your eyes. This one uses a webcam on top of your monitor that when you blink, you go forward in time. Like, blink in real life. You can go forward in time in the game. And that's a connection to your character, because you're doing something in real life that connects to your character in a game. So you feel like you're controlling them, even if all you're doing is activating a piece of code, but you feel like you're controlling them and get your own choices. You feel like you can actually have control of what you're going to do even if there's a set number of options, but they're options that you would probably pick. Like, you wouldn't just choose to go driving off the edge of a cliff on the first 10 seconds of a game, hopefully. But fear in video games is different than fear in movies because you have more control, as I mentioned earlier, but you can also kind of make stuff happen when you want it to happen exactly. So, let's say you want like a trapdoor to open with lots of cobwebs and stuff. You go down into the basement. There's dusty old stairs. Maybe you trip on a nail or something, and then something pops up. But it can all happen when it's supposed to happen, which is easier than in movies, which is why some games are credited to more than what they're actually doing. It's because, like, you feel like you're inside of them. But what is fear, though? Because, like, what makes you afraid? Fear on its own isn't really going to do anything because it's just an emotion. And feeling a raw emotion is powerful, but you have to direct it somewhere. It's like funneling something into a tunnel. If you just have like a whole wall of something and like an emotion going into a tunnel, only part of it's going to go through and it's not going to be as effective. But if you have a big funnel going in, then it'll be much more effective and it'll actually route all of the fear into the tunnel, let's say. This is what games and movies both strive to do. They both strive to be the biggest funnel, to capture the most of that emotion. It could be fear, happiness, anger, anything really. And it's really just who can make the biggest funnel. That's kind of the competition in games and movies. It's just who can make the biggest funnel. But sometimes it's not about having the biggest funnel, it's about controlling the funnel the most. So instead of just capturing the most of the raw emotion, try to capture more of the final details of the emotion. So once you have the amount of fear or anger that you want, you can control it kind of by manipulating the actual characters to kind of interact with the main character to make you feel slightly afraid of them. Maybe they say something that's kind of off to normal people, and it makes you kind of doubt them, but then they seem fine for another half an hour or so. Maybe they say another thing that's slightly more off. Like, just they say something that a normal person won't say. Something that's kind of like psycho-y, murdery kind of guy. You don't really want to be around that, but like they're your friend. They could never do something like that, really. So what they do is they get the build-up and then they control it. And if you don't control it, then it's just kind of boring. You have to be controlling, which sounds bad, but it's good in a video game sense because you want to be in control. You want to be like actually knowing what you're doing, because otherwise it's just you're watching it happen. If you're just watching it happen, you don't really feel a connection. So you have to be in a fine line between giving your character or giving your audience control and giving your studio control. So that's kind of the balance that people are working with, because normally people do cutscenes where you don't have any options, or maybe have like a choose for kind of thing where maybe you can choose one option, this will happen. Maybe two options will have the same route or something. Maybe all of them have the same route and you don't know unless you replay the game. But if you give all of the control to a person, they're bound to make some mistakes or some choices that you weren't expecting. That's where kind of bugs happen. Maybe they go to a spot that you weren't expecting them to go and it wasn't really finished or something. So it's a very, very fine line between giving your audience control and taking control. But what's the hardest thing to do is making them feel like they have options when they're really just going down a straight path. Like, picture you have a road, okay? There's all sorts of splits going off of it. Those are your choices. But then really, they all hop back onto the same road. So it's kind of like going out like a little bow. They all go back out, go on that path for a little while and then go back onto the main path, and you don't really realize that you're going back onto the main path. But that's normally what they do, because they go out and then they come back in to the main path, basically. So let's say you choose to talk bad to a character in a game. Normally you'll say, this character will remember that, and they do and they don't. Like, it might happen, like they might be a little more distant from you or something, but it won't really affect the end of the game if you make a small decision. But like if you kill someone, then they might, like, it might affect your choices. But just like the pop-up in the corner saying this character will remember that doesn't mean anything really. It just means that you made an actual decision in the game that affected something. Because you can make decisions all the time. It could be maybe you slide here and go under that. But they're not all important decisions, because generally you all go in one direction. It's not about like going backwards and forwards and left and right all the time. You generally go in one direction. But where it gets more complicated is when the games go backwards and forwards and left and right. That's how you get the better plots. You have to make them complex, but not too complex where you can't remember stuff that happened. It's like balancing on a needle. It's really hard, but if you can do it, it's super impressive. So you have to make it feel like you're just going in one direction. Maybe you'll have some flashbacks or something. But sometimes in a flashback, maybe if you do something in the flashback right or wrong, it'll affect something that's in the main timeline. So kind of going into like time travel stuff here. But if you're in the present right now, you go back forward or go back 20 years or something, you do the same thing that you're supposed to do, then you go back, nothing really changed. But let's say you talked bad to a character, maybe it'll spiral and then you won't know the character in the present. That's really how games can have good plots, is if you feel connected to a character and then you go back and then you can change something that makes you feel like distant from the character. Like you still like that character because you've been knowing them that whole game. But then maybe you just go back and make like one mistake to them, and maybe in the future they don't like you anymore. And you feel like, why did I do that? I wish I hadn't done that because I like that character. That's what you're supposed to feel. You're supposed to feel like torn away from them, which kind of sounds bad. But really, what they want you to feel is they want you to feel angry at the developers, really. The more angry you feel at a studio, the better the game is, as long as they're not buggy or whatever. But you should feel like angry at the studio for killing off this character or getting rid of this, because that's good. There should be plot changes in general. Kind of getting sidetracked here about fear and stuff, because this whole topic is fear. So let's say normally in horror movies and games, they normally have a very cool tone to them. It's never a warm tone, because warmth is more happy and uplifting. Cool tones are more dismal, gray, just more around flat curve kind of thing. Normally sadder kind of things. So instantly, whenever you go into a movie, you don't notice it after a while, but you can see if it's a cool or warm tones. Some movies will have super, super warm tones. Normally they're like romance dramas or something. Super warm tones. Makes you feel happy. And then some movies will have super gray tones. Maybe it's to make it feel more realistic. Maybe it's to make it feel more scary. Whatever the reason is. Most people either go warm or cool. They normally adjust it somehow. And after time, you don't really notice it, because you just accept that's how that area is looking like. But horror movies always, literally always use cool tones. Unless it's like a psychological game. They will use cool tones because it's more dismal looking and more gray. Sometimes it'll even be in black and white in some parts and stuff. And it's always very dark. No, why is it dark? Because we went into that before. Pop quiz. Okay, yeah. The most important thing is the camera. Because if you don't have a good camera setup, it doesn't have to be a good quality camera. You just have to know someone that actually knows how to use the camera. And normally they have a wider angle lens, or maybe it's a super close-up lens. Let's say it's a super close lens, and everything's kind of shaky, blurry looking, and then it'll suddenly focus onto this giant, scary monster thing. And it'll just be completely out of shot because you're just used to being like up close to this thing, and then it just like pops into the entire screen, fills up the entire screen with just this. Brings your focus to it, basically. And if you have a wider angle lens, it's more, oh, you can focus on this, but you also just could look at something in the background, which is sometimes what people do if they don't want to be afraid of something. They just look at like the top right corner or something. But if they have a closer lens, it'll fill up the entire screen, and you have to look at it, basically. There's always some sort of like screech pops up when something happens. Screech, it could be trumpets blowing or something. Really any sudden noise that's out of the ordinary, basically. And also, before the build-up, you can always tell when something is about to happen. Normally, either it gets quieter or it gets really loud. And if you hear it getting really quiet or really loud, something's about to happen. Normally, they go for really quiet because it's more of a opposites. Like if you go to 0 to 100, it's a complete difference. But if you go from 50 to 100, it's like, oh, it just got louder. So most will go quiet to loud, but some go loud to loud, which is decent, but it's still different. And for the build-up, there's normally some sort of heartbeat or pounding noise. And it's normally subtle, but it's there. Makes you feel like you're stressed, and like, because it makes your heart beat too, because I don't even know why, but it just makes you feel more unpleasant, basically. Because people don't normally hear other people's heartbeats, so putting that in there is kind of like, why am I hearing this kind of thing? So, overview kind of thing. Fear in games and movies, it's really about the use of music, camera, and lighting, sometimes other things. But it's really about the connection to your character or to other characters in a movie or show or game. Because you have to be connected. So they're connected by using the funnel. And then they kind of tweak little bits, let's say at the end of the funnel. Maybe they put like a little filter in there so only part of the emotion gets through. They filter it so that way you can only get the specified part of an emotion. Like fear is such a broad word. You can use it for anything. Like you could say, oh, that was so scary when you go on heights or something, like go across a bridge. But then you could also say that being chased by a psycho was scary too. Because fear is just an emotion. And movies and games want a very specific part of the emotion that makes you remember the game or movie and like recommend it to other people, basically. And if you have to be connected to the characters, because if you're not connected, you don't really feel that specific part of the emotion that they want you to feel. You have to be very connected to at least one character. Sometimes they do 2, 3. The more you're connected to, the less it deadens. Like, if you're connected to 5 characters, then it's not going to be super awful when one of them dies or something, because you're like, oh, I still have the other 4. But if you have to have 2 or 1 even, then you can be like, it's completely heartbreaking when one of them dies. Just like Iron Man in Endgame. I think everyone's watched that by now, so no spoilers, but it was completely a shock because he's been such a character in all the movies that when he actually died, everyone wasn't really expecting it. I mean, unless you saw leaks or whatever, but you have to be connected to the characters, have the build-up, have backstory. That's why epilogue is so important. Exposition, I mean. And exposition really gives composition to the movie. I made it wrong, but you have to be connected. That's the whole thing. Any good game or movie, you have to be connected. It doesn't have to be fear, horror. You have to be connected to them.